All right, let's dive in. Today, we're taking a look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict,
Hmm.
and we're going to be looking at it through the lens of an interview with Scott Ritter.
Okay.
Now, he's a former U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer,
Right.
and he's known for having some, well, let's just say,
Controversial.
yeah, controversial views, especially when it comes to U.S. foreign policy.
Definitely.
So get ready for some serious aha moments.
Yeah, this is going to change how you view those headlines.
Exactly. So Ritter's main argument is that Ukraine is actually losing this war,
Hmm.
which kind of goes against what we're hearing a lot in the mainstream news.
Right.
And he thinks they're having trouble keeping the West on their side.
Interesting.
So what makes him think that?
Well, he's saying the Ukrainian people have basically given up on the war effort.
But really?
Yeah, he claims they've stopped donating money.
Wow, that's huge, especially since they raised billions earlier on.
Right. It's a stark contrast.
So is there any proof of that?
It's tough to say for sure. We don't have independent verification on those donation numbers.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But if it's true, it could mean they're losing faith in a victory.
Like they're losing hope.
Yeah, exactly.
So if the people aren't behind the war effort anymore, what's the government doing to hold on to that narrative?
Well, Ritter says they've resorted to a propaganda campaign,
A propaganda campaign.
especially when it comes to the reported casualty figures.
Oh, interesting.
He claims those daily Russian casualty numbers that Ukraine puts out,
Yeah.
those are way inflated.
Really?
Yeah, he thinks they're doing it to make Russia look weak.
And Ukraine looks stronger?
Exactly. It's all about influencing public opinion.
But what evidence does he have for that?
He mentions sources on the ground,
Okay.
says his contacts are painting a very different picture of what's happening on the battlefield.
So what are they saying?
They're saying the Ukrainian casualty rate is actually way higher than what's being reported, and that Russia's the one making strategic advances, keeping their own losses low.
So basically he's accusing Ukraine of lying about their successes and losses.
To keep that Western aid flowing, yeah.
That's a bold claim.
He even says his sources have reported days where Russia had almost zero casualties
No casualty.
because of their careful tactics.
Again, though, is there any way to verify this?
It's really tough to verify anything in an active war zone,
Yeah, absolutely.
but it does make you wonder about the information we're getting.
It definitely raises some questions.
For sure.
Now, another thing Ritter talks about is those reports of North Korean soldiers fighting with the Russians.
Oh, yeah, that.
What's his take on that?
He completely dismisses it.
Dismisses it.
He calls it a Ukrainian fabrication.
Wow.
And he has a few reasons why he thinks that.
Like what?
Well, first, he questions the legal side of it.
Okay.
He points out that when these reports first came out, there wasn't any official agreement between Russia and North Korea.
That would allow for that kind of deployment.
Right, so if it were true, wouldn't there be some kind of acknowledgement of that alliance?
Yeah, you'd think so.
And then there's the practical side of things.
Okay.
Integrating North Korean troops into the Russian military.
Yeah.
He said that would be a total logistical nightmare.
In what way?
Well, think about it. Different training, different tactics, different equipment, even different languages.
Right.
Trying to blend them seamlessly into the Russian military structure,
That would be incredibly difficult.
to say the least.
So if he doesn't believe North Korean troops are actually there, why would Ukraine make up these reports? What would they gain from that?
He thinks it's a strategy to get South Korea involved.
South Korea.
Remember, South Korea said they'd only provide military aid if North Korea got involved.
Right.
So by creating this narrative...
Ukraine could be trying to manipulate them into helping out.
Exactly.
It seems a little far-fetched, though.
Maybe, but he does point out that most of these reports, if not all of them, come from Ukrainian sources.
Okay.
Some of which don't exactly have the best track record for credibility.
Right.
So he sees that as more evidence that the story is being manufactured.
For a specific purpose.
Exactly.
So we've got this situation where Ritter thinks Ukraine might be losing ground. They're struggling to keep public support.
Yeah.
And maybe even resorting to some elaborate propaganda.
Right.
If that's the case, what does he think happens next?
Especially with winter coming up.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, he paints a pretty bleak picture for Ukraine.
Oh, no.
He reminds us that a lot of their thermal power generation...
For heat and electricity?
Yeah, that's been destroyed.
Oh, right.
And it's unlikely they'll be able to fix it before the cold hits.
So what does that mean?
It could mean a full-blown humanitarian crisis.
Oh, wow.
Shortages of electricity, no running water, all sorts of essential services disrupted.
That sounds devastating.
And it gets worse.
Worse.
He predicts mass displacement,
Like refugees.
both internally and fleeing the country altogether,
Wow.
which would put a huge strain on those European nations.
That are already dealing with so many refugees.
From all over, yeah.
So not only is Ukraine facing potential military setbacks and this propaganda battle,
Right.
but also a humanitarian crisis.
That could impact other countries as well.
This is all pretty heavy stuff.
It is.
But let's shift gears a little bit and talk about peace.
Right.
Because Ritter has some interesting thoughts on that too,
He does.
especially when it comes to the Trump administration's role.
Right.
So what's his take on their approach to peace in this conflict?
Well, he looked at Trump's national security appointments
Okay.
and that peace through strength approach,
Yeah.
and he's not very optimistic.
Really? Why not?
He's worried that kind of approach could actually escalate things.
Instead of leading to real peace efforts?
Exactly.
So he's saying trying to force peace through military might could backfire.
That's his perspective.
And what about that idea of a phone call between Trump and Putin solving everything?
Oh, he's very skeptical about that.
He doesn't think it would work.
He says Putin won't negotiate on Russia's territorial claims.
So Russia wouldn't just give up those Ukrainian territories?
Because Trump asks nicely? No.
Okay, so what about other solutions?
Like what?
Like a frozen conflict or a demilitarized zone?
He doesn't think those are realistic either.
Why not?
He believes Russia's committed to keeping control over those annexed territories.
They won't settle for anything less.
Nope.
So if those options are off the table,
Mhm.
what does Ritter suggest as a path towards negotiations?
Well, this is interesting.
Okay.
He points to something called Istanbul Agreement.
The Istanbul Agreement.
Yeah, it was a peace deal that was reportedly negotiated
When was this?
early 2022,
Oh, wow.
but it was abandoned because of pressure from the West.
So what was in this agreement?
It offered a glimpse into what a negotiated settlement could look like.
Tell me more.
Well, some of the key points included Ukrainian demilitarization, limits on the size and equipment of their military,
Okay.
and even a ban on Stepan Bandera ideology and symbolism.
Hold on. For those of us who aren't experts in Ukrainian history,
Yeah.
who's Stepan Bandera?
He was a Ukrainian nationalist leader during World War II.
Okay.
He's a pretty controversial figure.
How so?
Some Ukrainians see him as a hero, but others, especially in Russia, view him as a Nazi collaborator.
Oh, wow.
His ideology, which is all about Ukrainian national identity and independence,
Yeah.
Russia sees that as a threat
To their interests.
and their historical narratives.
So these negotiations were tackling some really complex issues
Oh, absolutely.
that go way beyond just territory.
It must have been incredibly tough to navigate.
And what's even more interesting is what Ritter says about the Trump administration's understanding of all this.
So what does he say?
He basically accuses them of being clueless about these existing negotiation points. He calls it a major blind spot in their approach. So he's saying that despite all their talk about peace, the Trump administration wasn't really grasping the nuances of the situation.
Or the potential compromises that were already on the table.
That's a pretty big accusation.
It is.
It really makes you think about how complicated the pursuit of peace can be.
For sure.
Okay, we've covered a lot here.
Yeah.
From the possibility of Ukraine losing the war to the Istanbul Agreement.
Yeah.
But Ritter doesn't stop there.
What else does he talk about?
He connects these events to some seemingly unrelated things,
Okay.
like the collapse of the German government.
Interesting.
How does he tie that to the war in Ukraine?
He criticizes the media for downplaying the conflict's role in all that.
In Germany's political turmoil.
Yeah.
So what's his argument?
He says the war put a ton of pressure on Germany.
Economically and socially.
Both. Yeah.
And that ultimately contributed to the government collapsing. So the ripple effects of this war are reaching far beyond Ukraine's borders.
Affecting the politics of other nations as well.
Exactly.
And he also has a pretty cynical view of the Biden administration's continued financial support for Ukraine.
What does he think about that?
He sees it as a political move
No.
to basically shift blame for Ukraine's potential defeat onto the next administration.
Which would presumably be Trump.
Right.
So by giving Ukraine more money now
The Biden administration can say they did everything they could.
and set Trump up to inherit a losing situation,
Exactly.
that's a pretty bold theory.
It is.
Is there any evidence for that?
It's hard to say for sure what their motivations are,
Yeah.
but the timing of these funding increases.
Right, when a new administration might be coming in.
It does raise some questions.
For sure. But beyond these political games, Ritter also highlights a very real danger.
What's that?
The depletion of U.S. and NATO ammunition stockpiles.
Oh, right.
So how does he connect that to the war in Ukraine?
Well, he says that all this support for Ukraine,
Yeah.
plus other conflicts around the world,
Mm.
has really drained the West's ammunition reserves.
So we're running low.
And he argues that this leaves the West vulnerable
Vulnerable to what?
to potential conflicts in other regions,
Like with China.
especially with China, yeah.
So if something were to happen in the Pacific, for example,
The West might not be able to respond effectively.
because we've used up so many resources in Ukraine.
That's his argument.
That's a scary thought.
It is.
So he's saying that trying to help Ukraine might actually be creating weaknesses elsewhere.
And putting us at a disadvantage in future conflicts.
Exact.
And to make matters worse.
Oh, no.
He also points out the potential danger of escalation
Escalation.
because of the current U.S. military doctrine.
Okay, now this is where things get really serious.
Right.
What exactly is he talking about when he says that?
He's talking about the fact that current U.S. military doctrine allows for the potential use of nuclear weapons.
In a conventional conflict.
Even in the conventional conflicts, yeah.
So if the U.S. were losing a regular war...
There's a chance they might resort to nuclear weapons.
Wow.
And given how depleted our conventional ammunition stockpiles are.
That possibility becomes even more concerning.
It does.
So he's saying that by depleting our resources in Ukraine...
And sticking with this military doctrine.
We're creating a path towards nuclear escalation.
That's what he's arguing.
That's a terrifying thought.
It's definitely a sobering thought.
It seems like Ritter's suggesting that our current approach to Ukraine and our broader military strategy might be accidentally increasing the risk of a much bigger conflict.
That's the heart of his argument.
Wow, whether or not you agree with him.
It's important to understand these risks.
And consider the long-term implications of our actions.
Absolutely.
It's easy to get caught up in the immediate crisis
Yeah.
and lose sight of the bigger picture.
But understanding those long-term implications is crucial.
For making informed decisions.
Exactly. Ritter's analysis.
Whether you agree with it or not.
Yeah. Forces us to face some really uncomfortable questions.
And to think about the unintended consequences of our actions.
Exactly.
It definitely challenges us to think critically.
About the information we're receiving.
And question the assumptions we might be making.
For sure.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to touch on one more thing from Ritter's analysis.
Okay.
It really got me thinking.
What's up?
He connects the war in Ukraine to this idea of a shift in global power dynamics.
Oh, right.
What are his thoughts on that?
He argues that this conflict isn't just regional. It's a symptom of a much bigger shift in global power.
So it's part of a struggle between the established Western powers.
And rising powers like Russia and China.
Exact.
And he believes the outcome of this war
will have huge implications for the future balance of power.
If the West doesn't achieve its goals in Ukraine.
It could mean a decline in Western influence.
And embolden other challengers to the world order.
That's a big claim.
It is.
What makes him think that?
He points to the growing power of Russia and China.
Economically and militarily.
Both.
And how assertive they're becoming on the world stage.
He also talks about the declining unity within the West.
Oh, interesting.
Internal divisions, economic challenges.
Yeah.
He says those things are weakening our ability to project power.
So he's not very optimistic about the West's future.
He paints a pretty pessimistic picture.
Does he offer any solutions?
Not specific ones.
But he does emphasize the need for the West to rethink its strategies.
And its priorities.
We need to move away from that old Cold War thinking.
And find new approaches that work for the 21st century.
So it's not just about military strength anymore.
It's about adapting our economic and diplomatic strategies as well.
To compete in this changing world.
Exactly.
So we need to strengthen our alliances.
Invest in innovation.
And address our internal divisions.
If we want to maintain our position.
It sounds like he's calling for a more sophisticated approach to foreign policy.
One that recognizes the complexities of the world today.
And the need for adaptation.
For sure.
Now, whether you agree with his specific ideas, his analysis does raise some important questions.
About where the West is headed.
And the challenges we face.
In keeping our global influence.
Definitely gives us a lot to think about.
It does.
Now, before we move on to the final takeaway,
okay,
I want to circle back to something you said earlier. You said Ritter's analysis.
Yeah.
Even if we don't agree with it, forces us to confront some uncomfortable questions.
It does.
What are some of those questions that we should be thinking about?
Well, one of the biggest ones is whether our approach to the conflict in Ukraine is actually making the world safer.
Or more dangerous.
More dangerous, yeah.
Are we really helping Ukraine?
Or are we just fueling a conflict that could escalate into something much worse?
That's a tough question.
It is.
It seems like Ritter's suggesting our good intentions might be having unintended consequences.
It's definitely a possibility.
Another question is whether we're prepared for this multipolar world.
Where power is more distributed.
Are we clinging to old ideas of dominance?
Or are we willing to adapt to a more complex system?
And that ties into the question of our military doctrine.
Especially the potential for nuclear escalation.
Is that still appropriate in this new world?
Those are all difficult questions.
And they can be unsettling.
But we can't afford to ignore them.
You're right, it's easy to dismiss these challenging viewpoints.
Especially when they make us uncomfortable.
But if we want to make good decisions
And navigate this world effectively.
we need to be open to these different perspectives.
Even if they challenge what we think we know.
I completely agree, and that's why Ritter's analysis is so valuable.
Even though it's controversial.
It makes us think critically.
Question our assumptions.
And consider other viewpoints.
Exactly.
And that's what these deep dives are all about.
We're not here to tell you what to think.
But to give you the tools you need.
To form your own informed opinions.
So with that in mind, what's the most important takeaway from Ritter's analysis?
What's the one thing you want our listeners to remember? I think the biggest takeaway is the importance of critical thinking.
Regardless of whether you agree with everything Ritter says.
We're bombarded with information all the time.
From all sides.
And it's so important to question everything.
Consider different perspectives.
And dig deeper than just the headlines.
He's encouraging us to look beyond those simplified narratives.
And see the complexities behind these conflicts.
And honestly, that's what makes these deep dives so valuable.
They give you the tools you need to form your own informed opinions.
Exactly.
We're not here to tell you what to think.
We just want to give you the knowledge and insight.
To navigate this complex world.
And in a situation like the war in Ukraine,
that kind of understanding is so important.
Ritter's perspective is just one piece of the puzzle.
But it's a piece that's often overlooked.
Whether you find his arguments convincing or not.
They make you think.
And challenge that conventional wisdom.
For sure.
And those uncomfortable questions. They often lead to the most profound insights.
They do.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Mm.
I want to leave you with one final thought.
Okay.
If Ritter's analysis is even partially accurate,
Yeah.
what does that mean for the future?
What does it mean for the balance of power?
For future conflicts.
The very idea of peace.
Yeah.
In a world that feels so divided.
Those are big questions.
And they don't have easy answers.
But they're questions we all need to be asking.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Keep those questions in mind.
Keep exploring.
Until next time.
See ya.
Well, he's referring to the fact that the U.S. military doctrine, as it stands, it actually allows for the potential use of nuclear weapons.
Really?
Yeah.
Even in a conventional conflict.
Especially if a lot of American lives are at stake.
So let me get this straight. He's saying that if the U.S. were losing a regular war,
right,
there's a chance they might use nukes.
That's the scenario he's highlighting.
And with our conventional ammunition stockpiles so low?
It's a very unsettling thought.
It is.
He's arguing that by depleting our resources in Ukraine
and keeping this doctrine in place,
we're basically setting ourselves up for potential nuclear escalation.
That's terrifying.
It's definitely a sobering thought.
So Ritter's suggesting that our current approach
to Ukraine
and our overall military strategy might be making the world a much more dangerous place.
That's his argument.
Whether you agree with him or not.
It's something we need to think about.
Those risks.
And the long-term consequences.
Absolutely.
It's so easy to get caught up in what's happening right now.
And lose sight of the bigger picture.
But understanding those long-term implications.
It's crucial for making smart decisions.
You're right.
Ritter's analysis. Even if we don't agree with all of it.
It really forces us to ask ourselves some hard questions.
About what we're doing.
And what the consequences might be.
Exactly. It challenges us to think critically.
About the information we're getting.
And question our assumptions. Now, before we wrap up,
Yeah.
I want to go back to something you mentioned before. You said Ritter's analysis.
Right.
It makes us confront some uncomfortable truths.
It does.
What are some of those uncomfortable questions that we should be asking ourselves?
Well, one of the most important ones is whether our involvement in Ukraine is actually making the world safer.
Or more dangerous.
Exactly.
Are we really helping Ukraine defend itself?
Or are we fueling a conflict that could spiral out of control?
That's a tough question.
It is.
And there's no easy answer.
It seems like Ritter's suggesting that our good intentions could have some really bad consequences.
That's a scary thought.
Another question is whether we're truly ready for this multipolar world.
This world where power isn't concentrated in the West anymore?
Are we holding on to outdated ideas of dominance?
Or are we willing to adapt?
To a more complex system.
And that ties into our military doctrine.
And the potential for nuclear escalation.
Is that kind of thinking still relevant today?
These are all tough questions.
And they can be pretty unsettling.
But they're questions we can't afford to ignore.
You're right.
It's easy to shy away from these challenging viewpoints.
Especially when they make us uncomfortable.
But if we want to make informed decisions
And navigate this complicated world.
we need to be willing to listen.
Different perspectives.
Even if they challenge our own beliefs.
Exactly. And that's why Ritter's analysis is so important.
Even though it's controversial.
It makes us think critically.
Question everything.
And consider those alternative viewpoints.
Absolutely.
And that's really what these deep dives are all about.
We're not here to tell you what to believe.
We want to give you the tools you need to form your own opinions.
To make up your own mind.
So, with that in mind,
Yeah.
what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from Ritter's analysis?
What's the key takeaway here? I think the most important thing is the importance of critical thinking.
Yeah.
No matter what you think about Ritter's conclusions, we need to question everything.
We're bombarded with information constantly.
From all sides.
So we need to consider different perspectives.
And dig deeper.
Look beyond those simple narratives.
And try to understand the complexities of these situations.
And that's what we try to do here on these deep dives.
Give you the information you need.
To form your own informed opinions.
We're not here to tell you what to think.
We just want to equip you with the knowledge.
To navigate this world.
And with something as complex and important as the war in Ukraine.
That kind of understanding is essential.
Absolutely. Ritter's perspective is just one piece of the puzzle.
But it's a piece that's often missing from the conversation.
Whether you agree with him or not.
His analysis makes you think.
Challenges those assumptions.
And that's a good thing.
Those uncomfortable questions.
They often lead us to the most important insights.
So, to wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
I want to leave you with a final thought.
Okay.
If even some of what Ritter says is true, what does that mean for the future?
What does it mean for the balance of power in the world?
For the possibility of future conflicts?
For the very idea of peace?
Those are big questions.
And they don't have easy answers.
But they're questions we all need to be grappling with.
We can't just ignore them.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Keep thinking critically.
And keep exploring these issues.
We'll see you next time.
Take care.
Yeah, he really wants us to look beyond those oversimplified stories we usually get.
To see the real complexity behind these conflicts.
Exactly. And honestly, that's what makes these deep dives so valuable.
Right. They give you the tools you need to think for yourself, form those informed opinions.
Absolutely. We're not here to tell you what to think. We just want to equip you with the knowledge.
So you can navigate this crazy world.
Especially in a situation as volatile and consequential as this war.
Ritter's perspective, it's just one piece of a very complicated puzzle.
True.
But it's a piece we don't hear very often.
And whether or not you buy into all his arguments.
It definitely makes you stop and think.
Challenge those easy answers.
Yeah, those assumptions we all tend to make.
And sometimes those uncomfortable questions.
They're the ones that lead to the most important discoveries.
Couldn't agree more.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think I'll leave you with one final thought.
Hi.
If even a little bit of what Ritter's saying is true, what does that mean for the future? What does it mean for the balance of power in the world? For the potential for more conflicts? For peace itself in a world that feels so divided?
These are some really big questions.
And there are no easy answers.
But they're questions we can't ignore.
Absolutely not. We have to keep asking them.
We have to keep searching for those answers.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Russia-Ukraine conflict and Scott Ritter's perspective.
Keep thinking critically out there.
Keep exploring, and we'll see you in the next deep dive.